set, which I have to turn on. So I go to Window. These are all the bajillion tools that I might, or excuse me, these aren't tools, these are tool sets or sort of sub-menus of things that you might want to use. I've never used most of these, but some I use pretty often, and Pathfinder is a nice one. So you can see it's opened up this little window here for me, and it has all of these sort of visuals of what it's going to do to the things that you've selected. For here, I want to keep the exterior shape of these bubbles, but I want them to coalesce into a single object that doesn't have an interior. And so you can see this icon here looks like it's probably what I want to do. So I'm going to click that, and lo and behold, it worked really nicely. When I did this earlier today on my CS2 version of Illustrator, which is what I use in my office, I also had to hit this expand button to complete that action. And you'll know that you have to do that if it sort of creates this shape, but it still registers the original interior shapes. It doesn't display them, but it still knows that they're there. And if you hit expand, it will get rid of them completely, which can be much more useful. So now I have this nice bubble shape. I can use, my direct selection or my selection tool to reshape it any way I want, just like with anything else. If I hold down Shift, I can resize it true to its aspect ratio, and I can give it a new color. And so maybe I want it to be green inside. Or maybe I want it to have no color inside so that I can put it over something else and we'll still see through it to whatever that other thing is. So that's this red X or red bar through there is no color. If instead I want it to have a fill but no stroke, I can do no color in the stroke. And now you can see that it's just a red or orange blob with no outline color. So that was the exact technique that I used to create this thought bubble here, and then you can imagine that I just made some ellipses of different sizes here to make those shapes. It's very similar to what I did to create these call-out bubbles. I just did an ellipse, and then I created with the pen tool, which is another extremely useful tool. I created a little curved feature like this. I'm going to zoom in on that. So you can see that this has sort of a rounded tip, and that's not what I really wanted for my thought bubble, sort of whatever that thing is called at the end of the thought bubble. So what I'm going to do is I've now gone to my direct selection tool, which is the white arrow. And what I can do with this tool that I can't do with the black arrow is actually select the individual vertices that define this shape. And you can see when I select these vertices that they have what's called handles. And I can individually drag those handles around, and you can see how that's changing the way that that line curves that's attached to that vertex. I can also drag the vertex itself if I want to reshape this thing completely. And I can use that handle on this vertex down here to give it a pointy shape. So I'm just going to drag one of the handles all the way in until it snaps onto the vertex, so that handle no longer exists. You can see that the other handle is still there. I can still change the shape of this guy over here. So maybe I want it to be a little narrower and less curved, so I'm going to drag it in like that. But that other handle is gone, so that this is a perfect point now instead of a round end. If I want that handle back, I'm going to select this, and I'm going to use my, forgive me, I don't actually know where it is on the menu bar, but it's the hotkey for it is Shift C. Oh, there it is. What's it called? Convert Anchor Point tool, Shift C. And I can click on this anchor point that I've previously selected, and you can see if I just click and drag, I recreate both of those handles, and I can adjust them while I'm holding down the mouse button to recreate that shape. But since I didn't want to do that, I'm going to hit Command Z, and now I have the point of my thought bubble. So now I've gone back to my regular selection tool, the black arrow, and I'm just going to drag it up here. It doesn't matter that it's overlapping, partly because these are already one solid color, but also because I'm going to go in, select them both, and do that Pathfinder trick again, and now it's all one shape. And even now that it's one shape, say I'm like, oh, I didn't want it to be on that part of the bubble, that looks really stupid. I can adjust that to some degree. It's easier to get it right the first time, but I can adjust it a little bit just by using my direct selection tool and dragging those vertices around. but you can see that when I do that, it's going to be harder to maintain the perfect sort of elliptical shape of my thought bubble. So it's better to get it right before you merge those features if you want it to look perfect. Okay, so that's how I created the thought bubble. And again, this was in the default coloring. It's a little bit of a thin line. All right, so for creating these people, I drew them by hand. You could draw by hand, you could trace something that you found on the internet or that you have in a textbook by hand. Anytime you're using something that you have in a physical form, like a printout or a drawing, and you want to be able to digitize it, there's two ways of doing that. And what I'm going to do is, I forgot to bring in the original of that, but I'm just going to do a search for this, for depositional systems. We're going to just take an image from the internet and we're going to practice tracing these things. Put it in that folder, why not? Okay, so this is how you would bring in an image from the internet into your file. There's a couple ways of doing it. My preference is just to go to File, Open. I'm going to navigate to that, which I believe was here. Oh, here. I'm going to navigate to that. I'm going to open it. You can see that it was a JPEG image, which is a raster format, but it came into Illustrator just fine. But what it means is, as with any raster, if I try to resize this, it's going to get really pixelated. You can already see how pixelated it looks, right? So I can't resize it. But what I can do is trace over it and then resize my tracing sort of infinitely, which is what I did on that cartoon I showed you at the beginning. So for something like this, I might want to trace this because it has a ton of detail that I don't care about for my purposes, and I want to eliminate all of that detail. Maybe I'm tracing it because it was originally reproduced in a really, really low resolution, and I want to be able to produce it at a high resolution for a publication or a presentation. So there's a number of reasons you might want to trace it. Maybe I just want this element of the submarine fan here, and I don't feel comfortable drawing it freehand. Many reasons you might want to trace something. Always be wary of your attributions. If you trace something wholesale, you still want to credit the original artist, obviously. So there's two ways to do this. So I have this in a new file now. I can immediately copy paste it into my old one, but we'll just leave it here for now. You can see that it's on a layer. The first thing I always do is lock that layer and create a new one, and I call this original. And that way I know I'm not going to worry about moving this guy around underneath my tracing or anything like that. It's locked, it's untouchable. And then I'll call this one line art. And so what I'm going to do, I'm going to pick a level of zoom that I like. I'm going to turn on my pen tool, which is the hotkey of P, and you can see it over here in the menu. And I'm just going to start tracing. And I'm zooming in right now without going to the zoom tool by hitting Command+. All of these hotkeys, by the way, if you're using a PC, it's just going to be Control instead of Command. Pretty much everything is the same. So I can use Command plus and minus to zoom in and out without actually turning on the zoom tool. So as you're tracing with the pen tool, if you've ever worked with similar programs or maybe mapping programs, you've probably experienced similar things. This is just click, 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 and it's creating a shape for me, right? And each time I click, it's creating a vertex of that shape. And so I'm just clicking at a pretty coarse, fast pace here. And you can see it's got this funky white. Maybe that's getting in my way. I want it to have a black outline and no interior so that I can see what I'm doing a little bit easier. It's okay, I did those things and I can just keep going. I'm still active on that object. I don't have to reselect it or anything. And I'm just going around and I'm really coarsely tracing this submarine fan. Maybe I'm too far zoomed in and I don't even care about that level of detail. And I'm just going to keep doing this. And so you can see that this looks a little bit funky, right? Because I have all these angles in here that don't really look realistic. I'm tracing a submarine fan. It should have a lot of curves to it, and those curves are not being reproduced. So there's a couple ways we can fix that. First, as you're finishing your polygon, in this case I want it to be closed, so I'm going to hover over my first vertex that I created, and you can see that there's now a empty circle next to my pen tool, which is normally not there. And that means that I'm hovering over the final vertex, and as I click, it's going to close that polygon so that it's one complete feature. You don't have to close a polygon to create color within it. An empty polygon can still be filled with color, but it'll just be filled according to where it thinks its edges are. So this is a better way to be completely certain of where your color is going to go. So if I don't like the way that this looks with all of these edges here, you can see that's kind of just got a lot of angles that I don't really like. I'm going to select it. I'm going to hold down the pencil tool and do the smooth tool instead. And since that object is selected, it knows what I'm trying to do. I'm just clicking and dragging. You have to have sort of a steady hand for this. I'm clicking and dragging around the edge of that thing. You can see where my hand was unsteady and it made some sort of waviness, but that actually looks kind of nice, so I'm alright with it. If I wasn't alright with it, I would do smaller sections. And you can see that as I'm clicking and dragging along, it's taking those angular vertices and it's giving them curves. So if I go in with my direct selection tool and I show you what one of those looks like now, see it has those handles that we were looking at before. If I go to one of these vertices that I haven't adjusted, there's no handles on that, right? This is just a straight line from one vertex to the next, whereas this one is a straight line with the adjustment of these handles. So it's, I guess, a curved line from one vertex to the next. And I can adjust that curve manually if I want to. The other way you can do that without having to use the smooth tool is as you're drawing, and this takes quite a bit of practice, but it can save you some time. As you're drawing, you click along, and then instead of just clicking, you click and drag. And you can see that as I drag, I've created these handles, right? And I can adjust them on the fly as I'm drawing. And this is a way that in one step you can make a nice curved line, but it does take some practice, because if I want to create, so if I want this like really intense curve here, you can see how long those handles got. If I now try to do a less intense curve there, it's being affected and dragged by that pre-existing handle. Does that make sense? So I have to be careful of how intense my curves are. I can go back in later and I can edit that by saying, okay, I only want this half of the curve to be intense, so I'm going to drag that handle in and it's going to give me a smoother curve over here that's less intense. So that's something you can always go back and do later, but it's nice for it to look right the first time. There I had a curve that looked really funny, so I went back in with my, what's it called, anchor point conversion tool, the Shift-C, and I just clicked and dragged and recreated that curve in a way that looked a little bit nicer to my eye, and I can do it again over here. You also want to be careful. What I just did here is I dragged it the wrong way, and I'll just exaggerate that so you can see when I drag it the wrong way, it's going to create an inverted curve. So you want to make sure when you click and drag with this thing that you always drag it in the right direction. Okay. Is everything following so far? All right. So the other way you can do this, which I prefer, is called live trace.